This is lesson number 6. You should have it popped up on your screen. Let's make sure that, can you see that? Lesson 6, the student book?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so this is an actually really important lesson. It's one that comes up many times, and it's the question about what is the role of rabbis in Judaism? What's this concept of the oral Torah? A lot of people will ask, well, where is it written in the 5 books of Moses, this specific custom or this specific rule or the way you celebrate this holiday? How do I find that in the Torah itself? And the question is, do rabbis sit there and make up stuff? Do they just add on their own initiative, ideas that they think should be in the Torah? Do they contradict the Torah? Do they explain the Torah? Can anyone explain the Torah their way? So this is a really essential point in order to understand, in other words, the oral Torah. Oral as in it's passed down by mouth. There's the written Torah that God gave to Moses, the 5 books of Moses. No one disagrees with that. And then there's the oral Torah, the part that was not written down letter by letter, word by word, but was passed down verbally, teacher to student. So let's start with the introduction. Eliah, if you'd like to read what we have here up on the screen.
Lesson 6. Wait, can you guys hear me or is it too windy?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. Lesson 6. Let's talk it out. The oral Torah. When does Jewish law, or where does Jewish law come from? Is it all in the Torah scroll? Was it made up by rabbis over the course of generations? This lesson begins a unit on the sources of Jewish law. It goes without saying, the 5 books of the Torah are an important source of Jewish law. However, you may be surprised to discover that most of Jewish law is not found in the Torah itself, but rather as part of the oral Torah.
Very good. So this is what we're going to be exploring during this class. So let's start with the big idea number 1. So we even know how we're going to break this down into 3 sections. So let's start with section number 1, which is explaining that the oral Torah is not a contradiction. It's not a counterpart. It's not something in addition. It is essential and a part of the written Torah, meaning the same author had both ideas in mind and gave over both lessons simultaneously. So Caroline, if you'd like to read what we have pulled up on the screen.
Okay, let's see. I've got to scroll down. The big idea, 2 traditions, written and oral. God gave Moses 2 forms of Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah.
Very good. So this is a really essential point. It's not that God gave Moses 1 Torah, and then later on there came an oral Torah, but rather God gave Moses 2 forms of the Torah. So again, the same God gave the same Moses 2 forms of the Torah. And we'll explain later why, but God chose to give half of it written and half of it orally. So imagine you're going to the store on a shopping list for your mother, and your mother gives you 5 items that she writes down, and then she says, I also want you to buy cocoa powder. She didn't write it down on the paper. Would you say that everything on the list is important and cocoa powder is just something that's not as important? We would understand that the same mother gave the same person at the same time the list to buy. Some things she chose to write down, and some she chose not to write down for whatever reason. In the case of your mother, it might just be because she forgot. Now, God doesn't forget what he wants to write down. God chose to give it half written or some percentage written, and then a lot more orally. But it's from the same God to the same people. Let's go on over here to this part. And Sheila, if you'd like to read over here, what sort and text 1. So from the whole highlighted place. Oh, 1 second. Let's see if we can unmute you. Oh. Oh, there we go. Okay. Now we can hear you.
Okay. These are the laws, rules, and instructions, Torah, that God established through Moses on Mount Sinai between himself and the Jewish people.
Very good. So this is a quote from the book of Leviticus, one of the books of the 5 books of Moses. And we're seeing over here a quote where the Torah is alluding to the fact that there's also an oral Torah. Where do we see that? Let's read text number 2. Eliah, if you'd like to read text number 2. This is a commentary on this verse that we just read, Leviticus 26:46.
Is it Tarot or Tarot?
Torot, like Torah,
Toro.
singular.
Oh, Torot. Sorry,
Right.
I thought that was an A. I got confused. Torah. This teaches us that Jewish people were given 2 Torahs, a written Torah and an oral. This one?
Yep, yeah, you did good. So clearly over here that this is one of the places where we see that the Torah alludes to the fact that there were a written Torah and an oral Torah. And it says, if you look in this verse, Vehatorot, it doesn't say Vehatorah and the Torah, it says, and the Torot, which is plural. And the question is, what plural Torahs, what plural instructions did God give as books? We only know of one. And the answer is, the way the commentary explains it, that God gave the written, and he also gave verbally additional lessons explaining the written text. Let's read text number 3. Caroline, if you'd like to read from the Talmud and then text 3.
Okay. The Talmud echoes this notion, pointing to other verses that allude to another Torah, or at least another element thereof. Talmud Triacticate Berhot 5a. What is the meaning of, and I will give you the stone tablets, the Torah and the commandment which I have written to instruct? The tablets are the 10 commandments. The Torah is the 5 books of Moses. The commandment, the Mishnah, which I have written, this is the prophets and scripture. To instruct, this is the Talmud. This teaches us that they were all given to Moses at Mount Sinai.
Very good. So again, the Talmud over here is dissecting a verse, which Moses says from God, I gave you the tablets, I gave you the Torah and the commandments, which I have written down to instruct you. So the Talmud explains, why does it refer to this as multiple things that God gave? As if God gave tablets, then he gave us the Torah, and then he gave us commandments. The commandments are written in the tablets and in the Torah. So what's this additional thing? And the Talmud explains that it's referring to other aspects that are all divinely inspired at the time of the giving of the Torah. Even if it wasn't written in the same book, it was all given simultaneously to Moses.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can we ask questions?
Of course.
Okay, so when there, we know that this is when, the different forms of the Torah that were given. So when Moses came down off the mountain and he had the tablets that God wrote with his laser finger, and it was like Moses got very angry because they knew the oral law before he came down with this written law, because how they built the calf and they were worshiping the idols and all that. Before Moses came down with the tablets, they knew the oral Torah, correct? Is that why he got so, got angry because of what they did? But they already knew it was wrong before he came down with those tablets.
So if I understand your question correctly, when Moses came down from the mountain, the Jews, only thing they knew were the 10 commandments that God gave at Mount Sinai. The 10 commandments that he verbally said. So even though they didn't have the written tablets, but God said it, they heard it out loud. And the second commandment was, do not make other gods. And that was their transgression, that God just told you a few days ago, 40 days ago, not to make other gods, and they made other gods.
Right.
But the oral law was not given to them yet. The oral law only came to them after Moses came down from the mountain. He ended up not being able to teach them at that time, because first he had to go ask God for 40 days to forgive the people. Then he went up another 40 days to get the second tablets. And only afterwards did Moses come down and teach them the Torah that he received from God, the commandments, together with the oral Torah, meaning explaining the commandments. So we'll get into examples soon as to what we mean by the oral Torah. But just to give a simple understanding, when God told Moses, tell the Jews they should rest on the Sabbath, that's what it says in the Ten Commandments. Now, it doesn't say in the Ten Commandments, how do you rest on the Sabbath? Do I not turn on a fire, or do I not schlep heavy benches? Which, even though I would assume, if the Torah just said rest on that day, I would say, yeah, to light a match is not a big deal. It doesn't require sweat, and therefore I can light a fire on Shabbat. However, to pull tables and chairs and set up, that should be prohibited because that's heavy labor. And yet, when Moses came down from the mountain, he said, God wrote you should rest on the Shabbat. Let me explain to you all the details that God told me what is included in resting on Shabbat and what is not included. And he said, actually, schlepping heavy tables is allowed. God told me just a short note to write down, but he explained to me what he meant. And then lighting a fire, even though it doesn't take a lot of sweat, it's still prohibited. So that's what we mean by the oral Torah, where Moses read the verse, and then after he read the verse, he expounded on the verse. He explained to them. So let me tell you what this means. What are the guidelines? What are the details? What are the restrictions? When is it allowed? Who's prohibited? Who has to do this? And so on. Let's use an example here. I'll pull up on the screen. I'll help us understand a little bit of what we're talking about. So the question, of course, is what is the oral Torah? Meaning we know what the 5 books of Moses is. No one disputes that. We read it. It's cut and clear. But what's this verbal addition that we need to understand the Torah? So let me ask you, we'll ask Carol Ann, give me a 15-second rant. If I were to hire you to run a commercial for me for brushing teeth is healthy, what would you say in your rant? Just talk freely, no script, for 15 seconds. What would you say? Why should I brush my teeth?
You should brush your teeth because there's germs in your mouth. It gets rid of decayed food particles. It keeps your gums healthy. It stimulates circulation. It, keeps debris from collecting in your mouth that could turn around and make you sick. You don't want to be swallowing garbage. You want to keep your mouth as clean as possible so your teeth don't fall out.
Beautiful. Great job. Unscripted. You did a great. We're going to get to it in a second. I have 2 more, one for Sheila and one for Eliaf. Let's go over here. Eliaf, you can see us. Oh, I think she just got off a second. We'll get right back to her. Sheila, if I were to hire you from Dunkin' Donuts to run a commercial for me for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, why donuts are tasty, what would you say?
They're light, they're light and they're fluffy. They're just the right amount of sweetness. They're not heavy like cake. I don't know. I don't like donuts. I never eat that much, so I don't know what to say.
Right. Oh, good job. Very good. And are the white pieces in the air. They say this, we're a very well-established company. We have from the largest income of how much money we can make. This is all of us promoting a company or promoting an idea. Now, if I were to ask you, Caroline and Sheila, whatever you said, is that included in the statement where it says brushing your teeth is healthy, or included in the statement donuts is tasty? The answer is yes. Everything you spoke about for 15 seconds was included in this statement. However, you found the need to expound upon it. What are you doing when you're expounding upon these statements? What you're trying to do is make it more practical for people, bring it down to them where they can apply it in their personal life. You might say donuts are great in the morning to start off with your coffee. So I take the idea that donuts are tasty and I try to bring it into the most applicable fashion that I can. So too would be a great example for the written Torah and the oral Torah. The written Torah tells us the phrase, donuts are tasty, Apple earpods are good, brushing teeth is healthy. It gives you a one sentence. However, an advertiser or a teacher has to explain, a teacher or a doctor can go on for an hour explaining the benefits of brushing your teeth. He's not contradicting what this statement says. He's expounding upon it. He's making it more relatable in order to persuade the person to buy into it. Something where you can understand it, you can then go ahead and repeat it. You have a lot more knowledge. So too is the oral Torah. It's not here as something where we're contradicting, God forbid God, but rather we're coming here to explain, to expound upon it and bring it into a term where everybody can relate to it. Let's go on. We have over here, this is just the next one about what we mentioned before, Torot. Torot means plural. Torah, which is the common way we refer to the Torah, is singular. But the verse mentioned Torot, this was in Leviticus 26:46, in order to tell us that there were two Torahs that were given. Let's look at a simple example to explain this idea a little bit further, and that would be, if I were to say the Torah is a book, then that's it. But the Torah is not just a book. The Torah is godly wisdom. Godly wisdom is infinite. It has so much in it that is whatever you're going to write down is just a limited form of how much it actually is. So Torah is a little bit like a strand of DNA. A strand of DNA has in it, encoded within the DNA, is all the features of the entire organism. So too in the Torah, God encoded the entirety of his wisdom, which is way beyond the Torah and way beyond just even the world, because God is not only a creator of the world. God is God. He's so much greater than that. Yes, he created the world, but that's not what defines him. He's a lot greater than just that aspect of him. So the Torah is a very small encoded cryptid message, which has in it a way more in-depth understanding than what we see on it on the surface. So we can never even fully grasp the depth. Even till today, we're studying the DNA and finding out new things that it holds inside of it. So too the Torah will never fully be grasped by anyone because it's so infinite. It's a godly wisdom. And therefore, till today, we're still studying, dissecting, and involving ourselves with decoding the Torah, not in a way of ever contradicting or coming up with something new, but understanding that it's limitless, that there's so much depth involved in the Torah. So that would be the oral Torah, the part of the Torah that's there to explain the small coded message of the DNA or of the statements that we had before. Let's read just the next source over here from Maimonides, which he explains this same concept. And Caroline, if you'd like to read, how did it go down? And then text 4.
How did it go down? Maimonides explains the exact process of how the oral tradition was actually given over. The Maimonides' introduction to commentary to Mishnah. Know that each commandment that God gave to Moses was given to him with its explanation. God would tell Moses the commandment and afterward tell him its explanation and content. And so too with everything that is included in the book of the Torah.
Very good. So over here, Maimonides explains that ultimately God gave Moses the Torah, and then he gave him the explanation and told him how he should go about teaching the Torah to the next people. So summary of big idea number 1 is that the same God gave a written form of the Torah and simultaneously to the same person gave an oral Torah. Oral Torah is not a later invention. Let's go ahead with big idea number 2. And Sheila, if you'd like to read what we have pulled up over here on the screen.
Proving the oral tradition. There are three major proofs of the oral Torah is true. All Jews kept the mitzvah in a similar fashion for thousands of years, even though many of the laws are not mentioned at all in the written Torah. It is impossible to understand the mitzvah and perform them based on the written Torah alone. The written Torah makes reference to oral teachings that God gave Moses at Sinai.
Very good. So we're going to explain these three ideas. They're all entailing a lot of details, but this is just to give us an idea of how the second section of this class is explaining the proof that we know the oral Torah is true. So let's start with section number 1. And this is an introduction of the cholent. So let's just show you here a visual. As Jews, we always like seeing pictures of food. So is the Torah fake or fact?
It's so true.
So we have here a photo. Why is it customary to eat this on Shabbat? This is called in some places chamin, or in some places they call it cholent, or with slightly different variations. And the hint is in this picture. The hint is in the fact that there's steam coming out. There's something about the fact that it's hot that makes us want to eat this specifically on Shabbat. Can anybody think of an idea of why this came into a traditional Jewish food?
Because it cooks for a long time and you can put it up before Shabbos, obviously, and then it's done on Shabbos.
Right. And now why specifically do we want to have hot food on Shabbat? Why not just eat food that doesn't need to be hot?
To remind us that even though it's Shabbat and God wants us to refrain from work, he's still making us comfortable by having for us warm food, so that just because it's Shabbat, we're not supposed to suffer on Shabbat.
Right. No, very good. You're definitely heading down the right track. So let's get into the text as to where this came about. And Caroline, if you'd like to read introduction and then text 5.
Okay. Introduction. Cholent is very important. Throughout history, there have been various groups who rejected the legitimacy of the oral Torah. The Karaites were a group of Jews in the Middle Ages who completely rejected the oral Torah. They only kept the written Torah and ignored any of the rabbinic interpretations. One well-known point of this conflict between the Karaites and rabbis was how to interpret the following verse. You shall kindle, Exodus 35:3, you shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on Shabbat.
Very good. So we have over here a verse in the Torah where God goes out from the regular prohibition of Shabbat, which God just says, rest on Shabbat, don't work. He didn't say what work is. But this is one example where God does tell us a specific prohibition on Shabbat, and he says, don't kindle a fire on Shabbat. Now, there's two ways one can read this verse. So the Karaites, they said the prohibition is that a fire should not be burning in your home on Shabbat, meaning even if you have lit it before Shabbat, you have to extinguish it and be in complete darkness during Shabbat. So they did not have any candles lit in their home. They did not have any food that was hot if it was kept on the fire on Shabbat. They said all food has to be off the fire, all fires have to be extinguished during the holiday. So in their houses, if it was in the cold winter, they would not have a boiler on. They wouldn't have a fire running. They would sit in the cold and in the dark and eat cold food. The rabbi said, that is the incorrect interpretation of the verse, not because the rabbi said, well, I just believe that God didn't mean that. The rabbi said, Moses passed down in tradition, when he read this verse to the Jewish people, he said, God is prohibiting to light a fire on Shabbat, meaning if you have lit a fire before Shabbat and it stays lit on Shabbat, that is okay, because you're not actively doing anything on Shabbat. However, to light on the Sabbath, that's the prohibition. Therefore, the rabbi said, you can sit in a warm home. You just put wood in the fire before Shabbat. You can sit in a lit home, a home that has light, because you just light your candles before Shabbat. You can eat warm food on Shabbat, as long as one cooks it before Shabbat, and now it's just sitting on a fire or sitting in an oven on Shabbat, you cannot turn off the oven, you cannot turn off the fire, but you leave it on the fire and it is okay. Just leave the fire burning the whole Shabbat, or have the fire set up on a timer where it shuts off by itself. And you can then leave cooked food on the fire and take it off. There's a few restrictions about it, exactly how to do it, but the general idea is you can then have hot food on Shabbat. So because we read the verse in this way, and there were others that disagreed, intentionally, because of this dispute, we're trying to show that we believe in the tradition that was passed down from Moses on the interpretation of the verse, and we intentionally want to eat hot food on Shabbat. So let's read, Sheila, if you'd like to read, according to, and then, yeah.
Okay. According to the Karaites, is the fire that was kindled before Shabbat allowed in your home?
Yes.
Right, so the answer would be no. They say that it's not allowed, right? Even if it was kindled before Shabbat, you must extinguish it before Shabbat starts. Okay, next question.
When were they? I mean, like what year approximately?
This is about 2,000 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
According to the rabbis, is a fire that was kindled before Shabbat allowed in your home?
And the answer is yes, right? And traditional Judaism today still agrees with that. And that's why most people have ACs running and lights on. You cannot turn them off on Shabbat, but you can set a timer where it shuts off by itself, or you can just leave them on the whole Shabbat. Okay, now the next paragraph, precisely.
Precisely because this famous dispute touches upon such a fundamental tenet of Judaism, the legitimacy of the oral tradition, Shalachim Aruch, the ultimate book of Jewish law, encourages us to go out of our way to eat hot food on Shabbat day. That was warmed on a fire lit before Shabbat. This demonstrates our allegiance to the oral Torah, contrary to the Karaites.
Very good. So therefore, we intentionally eat hot food to show that we believe in the interpretation that was passed down, that one is allowed to have a fire on Shabbat if they lit it beforehand. And let's read it inside of a Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch. Caroline, if you'd like to read text 6.
The Shalom Alech Baruch Shayam. This is a mitzvah to eat. There is a mitzvah to eat hot food on Shabbat, as this is an honor and a delight of Shabbat. And anyone who does not trust the words of the sages and prohibits the eating of hot food on Shabbat, we must suspect that he is a denier of the Torah.
Right, because sometimes people will enclose their suspicion about allowing hot food as they want to be more loyal to the Torah. However, when one is trying to become more strict than necessary, it can cause one to then be less strict when necessary. They give a beautiful example about it. They say there was a guy, he comes to his friend and he says, "Can I borrow from you a silver spoon?" So he lends him the spoon, and when he brings it back, he brings him his regular size spoon plus a little baby spoon. And he said, "What's this? I lent you one spoon. Why are you bringing me back a large one and a small one?" He said, "Well, your spoon was in my home, and while it was there, it had a baby. So I'm bringing you back the baby." The guy's thinking to himself, okay, this guy's nuts and he's off the wall, but my gain, his loss, no problem. A few days later, he comes by and he says, "Can I please borrow your chair?" He borrows the chair, an expensive chair. He brings him back the chair plus a small one, and he says, "Your chair had a baby." The next day he comes and he wants to borrow his very expensive candelabra. He borrows it. The guy's all excited. "I'll get back one plus a small one." A few days pass. He comes to his friend and he says, "I'm really sorry, but your candelabra died. It just died and we buried it. It was so sad." He's like, "I'm sorry, my friend, but candelabras don't die." He says, "Well, if spoons and chairs can have children, then candelabras can die. When I gave you the children, you had no questions. However, all of a sudden when it dies, you're wondering what's going on." This is an example where when one first adds to the Torah and thinks, you know what, the Torah doesn't prohibit something, but I'm going to be extra strict, that's where they'll lead to reading other verses incorrectly and be lenient when they need to be strict. So one follows the Jewish law and not try to be more religious than God requires. This is it's a longer piece, but I'll just say it outside, so it doesn't take that long. And this is another way of explaining this proof of unchanged tradition in Judaism proves to us about the idea of oral tradition. If imagine a plane lands inside of Greece and off the plane comes Socrates, how much would he have in common with the local Greek community? The Greeks now are into maybe Greek salad. They're part of the modern day Western culture. They have nothing to do with Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. They don't speak the same language. They don't serve the same God. They deal with Christianity. They're not the same powerful country that excels in sports and marathons and all those other stuff of philosophy. There's nothing in common. It might be geographically the same location, but other than that, there's nothing in common with back in the day Greece to today. Let's use another example. Julius Caesar. He comes to Rome. He tries communicating with them. Unfortunately, they don't speak the same language. They bring in an interpreter, and he says, what about this temple that we had? He says, no, today we have the Vatican. What's the Vatican? A new religion, Christianity. Who runs it? A pope. He's from Argentina. It's not exactly an Italian thing anymore. What about the Colosseum? It's in ruins. Do we control the whole world? Do we at least control France? The answer is no. What are we famous for? Pizza. How much does Julius Caesar feel at home in Italy? He says, this is not the same country that I was involved in. Let's use the third example of Moses. If Moses were to land in 2021 in Israel, he would come off the plane and say, Shalom Aleichem, and the guy would respond to him, Aleichem Shalom, as if you're speaking my language. What's your name? Moshe. Oh, that's my name too. I'm also called Moshe. And he goes on and he says, maybe you have a pair of tefillin that I can pray with. Maybe you have a mezuzah, a talit, or it's before the holiday. I want to pray in a sukkah and shake the 4 species. And everything the guy says, of course, you came to the right place. What do you think? This is Pakistan. This is Israel. This is where we celebrate Judaism. We have tefillin for you. We could give you a Torah scroll. And he comes to a children's school, and they're singing Torah tziva lanu Moshe, the verse in the Torah that says, Moses commanded us the Torah of God, and he gave it as an inheritance to every Jew. Moses feels at home, even though he lived almost 3,500 years ago. He says they're celebrating and they're fulfilling God's commandments just like we did. Yes, there might be small changes in the architectural design and the clothing, but the language, modern day Hebrew, is slightly different. But those that are studying also the text, it's exactly the same text. We read the same Torah the way God gave it to Moses. This shows us an oral tradition allows it to pass down from generation to generation without changing, unlike other traditions which were written down in the books, but didn't go throughout the generations. Let's move on to part number 2. And Sheila, if you'd like to read proof number 2 and then read text, meaning these 2 lines, and then read text number 7.
Rabbi Yehuda Halevi offers proof for the oral Torah's truth in his book, the Kuzari, which takes the form of a conversation between a rabbi and a king who wants to convert to Judaism. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi Kuzari, Rabbi, I further wish to be instructed on the question as to what makes an animal lawful for food, whether slaughtering means cutting its throat or any other mode of killing. Why killing by Gentiles makes the flesh unlawful? What is the difference between slaughtering, skinning, and the rest of it? I further desire an explanation of the words, let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. Does this refer to the house or estate, where we can have many houses, territory, district, or country? For the word place can refer to all of these. What then does it mean? I should further like to know where the prohibition of work on the Sabbath begins. Why pens and writing materials are not allowed in the correction of a Torah scroll on Shabbat, but lifting a heavy book or a table or entertaining guests and all cares of hospitality should be permitted, although the guests would be working very hard. The host would be working very hard, sorry.
Yeah. So what he's saying here, this is from a famous rabbi. He has a book, this like defending Judaism and explaining the basics. He writes it in a way of question and answer between a rabbi and a king. And he says, how do I know that oral tradition is right? Because read any law in the Torah and you'll have questions galore on how exactly is this supposed to be done. God says you should slaughter, but he never said what's considered slaughtering. Do I do it from the front of the neck or the back of the neck? What happens if I peel the skin off the animal? Is that considered okay? When God says, don't go out of your place on Shabbat, am I not allowed to walk out of my bedroom, my house, my living room, my front yard, my backyard, my community, my country? So Jewish law explains what this means. And it means don't walk out of the city. If there's no more homes, you could only walk up to about 3,000 feet outside of a city if there's no homes there, because God wants one to rest on Shabbat, not to go traveling distance, even if it's by foot. So these are examples where the Torah just writes a general law, but it doesn't explain. It's like someone that never heard of brushing teeth, and he sees a slogan that says, brush your teeth. He says, what do you mean brush my teeth? With what? Do I brush it with a hairbrush? Do I use water? Do I use soap, shampoo? Oh, there's toothpaste. What's toothpaste? How many times do I brush my teeth? Which teeth do I have to brush? How often? How long do I have to brush for? Do I just touch each spot for 1 second, for 5 minutes? These are questions that we take for granted, but if we read the Torah and never had any explanations, we would be stuck by almost every verse asking questions as to, okay, what are the parameters? Like we mentioned in a previous class, when God says, have children, what exactly does that mean? Who has to have children? How many children? What happens if they don't have children that survived, the child passed away, and so on? So all these questions show us that one cannot understand the written without the oral, without what was taught simultaneously at the same time. Let's look over here just at another slide that brings out this point that we mentioned earlier. We have Moshe Rabbeinu. Of course, this is not his actual tefillin, but this is for illustration purposes, assuming a very old pair. He put on tefillin, and then you have Moshe Katz from 2021 putting on tefillin by the temple wall, by the western wall. Again, we have maybe the straps and are a little bit more worn out here, and the boxes are not exactly beautiful like these that were made partially with machines, but the idea stays the same. How does that come about? When we have an oral tradition and everybody does it overall the same, that proves to us that the oral tradition is true. We're going to get to this example in a moment. So here we just discussed about questions in text from the Torah if we don't have an explanation. Let's read another example from Maimonides. Caroline, if you'd like to read Maimonides, and then text number 8.
Maimonides, here is an example when God said to Moses, you shall live in booths 7 days. Afterwards, he made known that sick people are not obligated in it, nor are the wayfarers, and that it only be covered with that which grows from the ground, and that he should not cover it with wool or silk or vessels, even from that which grows from the ground. For example, comforters and pillows and clothes. God made known further that eating and drinking and sleeping in it is all an obligation, and that its space should not be less than 7 finger breadths long and 7 finger breadths wide, and that the height of the booth not be less than 10 finger breadths. When Moses came, this commandment and its explanation was given to him. And so it was with the other 613 commandments. Scripture states that the commandment and its explanation was translated orally.
Very good. So over here again, Maimonides uses an example of the laws of a sukkah. The only thing God tells us is sit in a tent for 7 days. Now, what size does this tent have to be? What cover should be on the roof of the tent? Now, we know the laws that it has to be something that grows from the ground, but not any more connected to the ground. And it cannot be anything that was processed into a material. You cannot, spread out a sheet of linen on your roof. That doesn't qualify. So there's many laws explaining it of who's exempt and what you have to do inside the sukkah. But all that was given verbally when God told Moses the law. He said, write down, sit in a tent for 7 days. Now give me 4 hours and I'll explain to you all the laws that are relating to this one principle. Let's examine, I'll give you guys here a few verses in the Torah, which we'll take and see if we can figure out what we're supposed to be doing without the commentary. So the verse says, the first one we'll start with, this is in the book of Leviticus 23:40. The Torah says you should take on the first day of the holiday of Sukkot a beautiful fruit. What is a beautiful fruit? That's the big question. Everybody would say, God didn't say take whatever you consider as a beautiful fruit. He said take a beautiful fruit. And somehow, throughout the generations, we've never heard of a Jewish community that takes anything other than the etrog. The etrog is the one that everybody takes. Why does everybody take this one? The Torah doesn't say it. The Torah just says take a beautiful fruit. And the answer is, again, the oral tradition said when Moses told them that verse, he said what God means, and the Talmud goes on to explain how we know this. But from the literal text, it doesn't say the word etrog. But Moses said, this is what God means. And every community has taken this one and only this one. No one disagreed and said we should take a mango. So again, the literal text would not help us unless someone told us simultaneously when you read that verse, what does it mean? Let's look at another verse. This is a famous commandment of circumcision. The Torah says, cut off the blocking, they didn't finish off here, of your skin. Now the blocking of your skin, there's all over your body, there's skin that you can cut off. It could be the tip of your nose, it could be the tip of your toe, the tip of your elbow. How do I know what's considered blocking? It speaks about in the prophets about the blockage of the heart. Maybe you have to rip open the skin that blocks your heart and have an open heart surgery. How do I know what exactly is included in a circumcision? Again, we must come to commentary where Moses, when he read this verse, he told the Jewish people, God, explain this to me. And that's what Moses was doing on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Because to receive 10 tablets that take less than 5 minutes to read, Moses, a smart fellow, he wasn't dumb, didn't have to stay there for 40 days to hear 10 commandments. God was telling Moses at that time all of the commandments and all the laws pertaining to it. Who can circumcise? When does a person have to be circumcised? Which that says in the Torah, 8 days. But what happens if they didn't do it 8 days? And what happens if there's a medical condition which prohibits him from having a circumcision on 8 days? And all the laws which are discussed today regarding circumcision were passed down from God to Moses. Another example, this is a picture of a circumcision. Another example would be the verse says, we read this in the Torah 2 weeks ago, this month is the first month. The Torah doesn't say what is the commandment here. Is God just notifying Moses that January 1st is the first month? So the commentaries explain that God is commanding us to set aside a calendar that goes according to the moon. And there's books and books in Jewish law explaining how we set up the Jewish calendar, because it's a complex calendar to set up. It's not a very simple one like the secular, and that's why holidays are constantly shifting earlier and later, because we go according to the moon, which the moon has 11 days less in the calendar than the sun. So we have to make leap years. So there's so many details included in a verse that just says, this month is the first month. But it means set up a calendar system, and God explained to Moses how to do it, right? That's the commandment of having the Jewish calendar. Another one, this is a popular, the Torah doesn't say on Yom Kippur a lot of information on what's prohibited. It says you should torture your souls. What does it mean, torture my soul? Do I have to jump into a fire on Yom Kippur in order to feel a lot of pain and scream? Do I have to wear shoes that are very tight on my feet so I feel that ache of I don't have any place to relax? Do I have to run nonstop for 25 miles? Or is there a prohibition? Don't eat food, don't wear leather shoes. Like we know the laws of Yom Kippur, we don't eat, we don't drink, we don't have relations are prohibited on that day. We don't shower or bathe. That is something that Moses had to explain to the Jewish people when he gave the commandment. He said, God wrote in the Torah and he said, he just wants to be written, don't have pleasure or torture your soul on that day. But he explained to me what is included. And the last one over here is a verse which we say in the Shema, they shall be for a sign between your eyes. This is very cryptic. What should be a sign between your eyes? What do I put there? Do I put there a whole Torah scroll? Do I put there just a piece of parchment? Do I put a piece of paper writing God's name? Do I put nothing and it's just metaphorical? We got to the tefillin, but it doesn't say in the Torah, wear black boxes with black straps going around your head. It should sit on top of your forehead. The knot should be in the back of your skull. The tefillin should be on your weaker arm, facing your heart, 7 straps along them. All these details were not given clearly in the Torah. How do we know them? Because Moses explained to us when he read the verse, all of the laws that God told him at the time. So again, we see here just a few examples of how little we can understand the Torah without the oral commentary. So that forces us to say, no God would give a Torah that is unexplainable, expecting us to figure it out. Must be that simultaneously, he gave us verbally the explanations, and that's why we've yet to find a community that doesn't wear tefillin like this, that doesn't wear tefillin on their head and their arm, and someone to say, oh, you know what, tefillin actually, they're supposed to be made out of rocks from the old city, and that's what you're supposed to wear on your head. Everybody agrees that it should be made out of parchment, leather skin, from a cow, writing certain paragraphs. So back in our student text, we have over here that verse from Leviticus, take on the first day a beautiful fruit, and we said it's an etrog. How do we know that? Because that is the way it was passed down. And yes, there are explanations later as to how it's hinted to in the word, because hadar, which means beautiful, also means that lives, and the etrog lives and grows on the tree year round. It doesn't have a season where then it falls off the tree. It keeps growing on the tree. So there are hints to it. However, clearly the Torah doesn't state which fruit one should take. Let's read proof number 3, that the Torah is given. The oral Torah is also given by God. And Sheila, if you'd like to read another way, and then text number 10 from here all the way.
Another way we know that the oral Torah is true because the written Torah itself includes references to it. We will explore a few examples. Ritual slaughter. The verse below speaks about how to properly slaughter animals. Prior to this point in the Torah, animal slaughter is limited to sacrifices in the temple. Here, the Torah tells us that we should wish to eat animals for our own pleasure outside the temple. That is fine, so long as we slaughter the animal in the method as I have instructed you. If the place where God has chosen to establish his name is too far from you, you may slaughter any cattle or sheep that God gives you as I have instructed you, and you may eat to your heart's content in your settlements.
Very good. So over here, the Torah says, if you notice, it says here, as I have instructed you. God says, slaughter the animal as I have instructed. If you read the entire Torah, God doesn't say how to slaughter animals outside of the temple. He doesn't say that you have to use a sharp knife and cut it from the bottom of the neck and make sure that there's no waiting and you cannot tear it and you have to check the animal to make sure it's healthy. It doesn't say that clearly in the Torah. So let's read over here the commentary. And Caroline, if you'd like to read the Torah and then text 11.
The Torah clearly references ritual slaughter as something previously commanded, but where? There isn't any mention thereof up to this point in the Torah. Rashi explains, you may slaughter as I have commanded you. We learn from here that there is a commandment regarding slaughtering, how one must slaughter. Since this commandment is not written in the Torah, we deduce that these laws of the ritual slaughtering these are the laws of ritual slaughtering given orally to Moses on Mount Sinai.
Very good. So because the Torah says, as I commanded you, we say, what is the commandment? What we have passed down from generation to generation. How did we get it? God told it to Moses on Mount Sinai. He said, I'm going to tell you verbally how to do it. And in the Torah, just write down, slaughter as I have commanded you. And you will tell the Jews what I have commanded you how to slaughter. Let's look at another example of proof that there was some discussion that Moses had with God other than the written Torah that we have. And Sheila, if you'd like to read example 2 and text 12.
Another example of a reference to the oral Torah is the written Torah is from the following verses that describe Moses judging the people based on system of mitzvah and halakha. Next day, Moses sat as judge among the people while the people stood about Moses from morning until evening. But when Moses' father-in-law saw how much he had to do for the people, he said, "What is this thing that you are doing to the people? Why do you act alone while all the people stand around you from morning until evening?" Moses replied to his father-in-law, "It is because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come before me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make known the laws and teachings of God."
So we have here a case where Moses is teaching the laws, and this happened right after the giving of the Torah. And the question is, what does Moses know that the Jewish people don't know? They all heard 10 commandments from God, and that's it. There is no other laws that was given that God told everybody. So why is Moses the judge? What was he basing his judgment off? Where did he get his book of laws? So let's read here Rashi. And Caroline, if you'd like to read, Rashi explains in text 13.
Rashi explains that this story took place the day after Yom Kippur, which was effectively one of Moses's first days down on earth after going up to heaven to receive the Torah. It came about on the next day. This was the day after Yom Kippur. This is what we learned in Sephari. Now, what is meant by on the next day? On the day after Moses' descent from the mountain, which took place on Yom Kippur.
Very good. So the question is, what was Moses basing his laws off of if he just came down from the mountain and there was only the 10 commandments? If all Moses received was the written Torah, it would be very odd to have such a complicated legal system in place the day after he comes down from heaven. There would be hardly any material for Moses to base his judgment off of. Rather, we learn from here that there must have already been a robust, thorough system of laws that God gave orally to Moses, and therefore Moses was the judge. Moses says, I heard it all from God, and I have to be the one deciding now between everybody's disputes as to what does God want me to do? What are God's laws saying in this case? So again, we have here, this is another example where the Torah hints to the fact that there was an oral Torah given to Moses at the same time. Again, not contradicting the written Torah, but explaining the details of the written Torah. And today, whatever we see in Judaism today, how matzahs are made even is something that's passed down by tradition, passed down orally. Because the Torah just says they ate matzahs. I don't know what a matzah looks like. I never heard of the word matzah before. How do I know that it's this brown, it's this round pita bread that didn't inflate, that's still, hard like a cracker? Which there are, to be honest, there are customs that actually have it more of a pita, but how do I know that it's something that didn't rise and it looks the way we have it? It could be many other options as to what exactly it's supposed to be. So let's read over here the summary. Sheila, if you'd like to read the summary of point number 2.
We have covered big idea number 2. There are 3 major proofs that the oral Torah is true. 1, all Jews kept the mitzvah in a similar fashion for thousands of years, even though many of the laws are not mentioned at all in the written Torah. 2, it is impossible to understand the mitzvah and perform them based on the written Torah alone. 3, the written Torah makes reference to oral teachings that God gave Moses at Sinai.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So over here, I'll just show one more example on this slide. If you ask yourself, everybody went to school, and in school you have teachers teaching you from the books, and you ask yourself, why do I need teachers? Why don't I just read books? School should be A bunch of kids come in, they give them books, and they say, read the books, and then you're done. Where do teachers come to play? And the answer is the teachers are not just there to control. Because even in college, you'll have professors. The teachers are there to help you understand the written text in the book. Without it, it will be extremely difficult. People will be making serious errors with reading the text in the book without having a mentor, a guide, a professional in that field explaining to them how to understand the text. Let's move on to section number 3. And this is a big question. In number 3 is, why would God want the oral Torah? Why not make it simple and make everything written? Why shouldn't God just write down everything from A to Z, spend all the time you need? Why bother with having part of it written, part of it given orally? So we'll go through, there's many answers, of course, to this question, but we're just going to go through a few of them. And Caroline, if you'd like to read big idea number 3.
Why would God want an oral Torah? The Torah is too vast to completely transcribe. 2, oral teachings cannot be stolen. Number 3, an oral tradition ensures that every student will learn it properly from a reliable teacher. 4, the oral Torah is written on the people, creating a stronger connection.
Very good. So we're going to explain all these points in case something wasn't completely understood. We're going to go through these 4 ideas. So let's start with point number 1. And Sheila, if you'd like to read why not written, and then text number 14.
We are halakhically, it is in fact forbidden to transcribe the oral Torah. Rabbi Yehuda bar Nekmani, the interpreter of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, expounded, matters that were written may not be expressed orally, and matters that were taught orally may not be expressed in writing. Rabbi Yochanan says, God made a covenant with the Jewish people only for the sake of the matters that were transmitted orally, as it is stated. For on the basis of these matters, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel.
So we see here that it was intentional, that it was till about 2,000 years ago, it was prohibited to write down the oral law. The only reason why they started writing it down is because of the expulsion from Israel, and the Jewish people were spread out all over the world, and they realized if they wouldn't write it down and establish study halls where they study the text of the oral law, it will all be forgotten. But until then, there was a prohibition of writing it down. Why is that? Because intentionally God wanted a written Torah. Why should there be a written Torah? So let's discuss these reasons. And Caroline, if you'd like to read why, and then text number 15.
Why is an oral version of Torah preferable to a written record? Wouldn't writing down all of the Jewish law be a better way of preserving it accurately? There are a number of answers to this question. The rest of this lesson will present 3 of them. Number 1, the Torah is too vast to completely transcribe. Orality demonstrates the vastness of the Torah. The Talmud makes the argument that the Torah is simply too vast to transcribe in its totality. Rabbi Abba Saduhina said, if a person asks you, why was the oral Torah not written down in the manner of the written Torah, say to him, it is because it is impossible to write down all of the oral Torah. Rather, what should a person do? He should put in effort and strain himself to study the words of the sages.
Very good. So he says over here clearly that it was intentional. God prohibited to write it down. Our job is to study the oral tradition. Let's discuss over here. I'll give an example to understand this first point. And we'll start with a question. Have ever one of you, either Caroline or Sheila, instead of sending a text message to someone, decide, you know what, I'd rather call them or leave them a voice note, leave them a voicemail, rather than text a message?
Always.
I'm assuming, yes. Okay, Sheila, always. Caroline, has that ever happened to you where you said instead of texting? I'd rather just call them and speak to them or leave them a message or send a voice note.
Yes.
100%, right? Most people, this is normal. Now, if I were to ask you, why would you do that? What would you give me the main reasons as to why you didn't want to write it down and you rather prefer to speak it?
Well, because if I write it down, it would be brief, but I want the person to understand what I'm conveying, and I want to be able to explain it properly, and why,
Yeah.
why this is happening, or this is what's going to be happening, why it's important to know more detail about it.
Yeah, very good. So in general, you would say you feel you could express yourself better when it's verbally than when it's written down by text. The person understands, you can go through. And other basic reasons is usually if it's a short text, see you 9:30, it's easy to write. I don't need a call for that. But if it's a long explanation or a long conversation, it's a waste over text. I might as well call. It's too long to text. That's what people would say. Another
the other reason is because it's like it shows that you care more. You're taking the time to that they're important enough that you want to explain it properly because you care about them.
100%.
And also the inflection in your voice. Things get lost when it's flat and you read it. You don't get the same inflection. You could say one thing and you think it means something else, but you say, well, that's not what I really meant, because you take it literally.
Right. 100%.
When it goes back and forth, when you have it back and forth, and you go, no, that's not exactly what I meant. I meant this. Even though if you just read it, it could mean something else.
Right. 100%. You guys are both bringing up amazing points, all that we want to discuss, that it's personalized. When I call you, it loses that copy paste type of feeling. When I send you a text, I could think, I just copied it from someone else and I sent it to you. If I called, it has that personalized voice feeling of a touch. It's more authentic. So too, like Sheila was saying, when you speak about it, you can make sure it's properly comprehended. You hear the tone of my voice. You hear if I'm speaking in a sarcastic tone, if I'm saying it literally. There's a lot more that can be given over when it's verbal. So too,
and it gives them the opportunity to ask questions.
Very good. That too. It's not a monologue. It's something that person can respond. They can say, "Is this what you mean?" And then you could say, "No, I'm sorry, but you misunderstood. Let me clarify that again."
And do you think, Rabbi, that's what was going? I mean, how God loved Moses so much that he gave him the written law, but he cared about him so much to have, and at loss, of course, but to have that dialogue, to be able to talk to Moses and then have Moses ask him questions, and with so much love that God would, explain it to him. No wonder he got so angry when he came down from the mountain, because he really experienced such a personal level of God's love.
100%. Exactly the point we're trying to make. When one says it orally, it shows how much they care for the other person, how it's personalized, how it's authentic, how it's meaningful, how much it's not like I wrote a book and I pass it on. Imagine you get married and you just, instead of speaking to your spouse, you say, here's a book, all the affection that I want to give you, all the rules for my house, just read the book. And if you have any questions, shoot me a text. Otherwise, looking forward for a beautiful marriage of you reading the book and having all your answers. Or imagine you tell your children, we have a book that we wrote for the first child, and since you're child number 8, there's no need for us to waste our breath to teach you the rules. Just read the book and everything will be great. That would be very unsensitive, very unpersonalized. No one wants to have that type of relationship. God wanted a relationship where it's feeling that the person is a part of it. Someone can ask questions. They have their understanding. They get the neshama. They get the soul behind the text. They get the feeling of a God behind just a plain, simple text, and therefore it was given over. So number one, it's too vast. Sometimes there's just too much information to text. I might as well just call you. Sometimes I don't want someone to take a screenshot of my text and then pass it on to someone else, misquote it, or make as if it's their own. So I say it verbally. When it's said, it's not something that someone can take a screenshot of and steal it. Sometimes I want to make sure the person knows I mean it personally, just to them. So these are the advantages of why God wanted an oral Torah to be given down to us. So let's explain it. Point number one, we have here voice notes versus text, and we have the first point we mentioned. It demonstrates the vastness of the Torah. The Torah is so great that having a text really minimizes it. Having an oral tradition which goes on forever and ever shows just how deep the Torah is and how much we can continue to dissect and find out new aspects in the Torah. Let's read the second answer. And that, oh, sorry, that's right here. Answer number 2. And Sheila, if you'd like to read answer number 2.
Oral teachings cannot be stolen. A second approach is that a book can be stolen and appropriated by another nation. Oral teachings, however, can be preserved faithfully by the Jewish people. The following midrash written during the medieval period seems to take this approach. Do you want me to read that?
Yeah,
read that?
Yeah.
Rebbe Yehuda, the son of Shalom, said, when God said to Moses, write the Torah, Moses requested that the Mishnah should also be written. God saw that in the future, the nations of the world will translate the Torah and read it in Greek, and they will say, we are Israel, messing up the balance of the power over who controls the text. Therefore, God said to the Gentiles, the Mishnah was given orally. Oh, that's good.
Very good. So this is in order to protect your copyright, in order to protect your intellectual property. You don't want to give out everything in a book. Tesla doesn't write all their secrets on how you make electric cars in a book, because if they do that, the next company will say, we're the new Tesla. What makes you Tesla? Who says that you're in charge? If everything in the Torah is written down, any nation can pick up the book and say, Jews, what proof do you have that you're the Jews? We know the Torah just as much as you do. We study it. But when there's an oral tradition that was passed down within the Jewish people, no nation can come up and say, we know the Torah just as much as you do. We say, well, explain this, explain that. And they can't, because it's not in the written text. So it allows for it to be preserved and make sure that it doesn't get lost or stolen when it's passed down orally. We're going to explain a little bit about the lost later, but the stolen aspect allows the Jewish people to show that they have the complete control, meaning that they're the real chosen nation. They're the ones that can open up the safe. It's like a guy that has a safe, and a lot of people come and they want to try to open it. The only one that can access it is the one with the key. So the safe is like the written Torah, but who can access it? The one that has the oral Torah. The Jews come in with the oral Torah, we can access the safe, and that proves to everyone that we are the true owners. Let's use this as an example. You have a password when you want to write down to protect something, you have a password. Now, how do you make sure no one's going to find your password? If you write down your password just where you wrote everything else on your website, it's not going to be protected. So your password has to be in a cryptic way. You write down in a hint. Even if you keep it on a paper, you don't write down password for checking account is. You'll usually write down, maybe you'll put a number or two before or after, just to hint to yourself what it is, but in a cryptic way that no one else can read. So too with the Torah, God writes it in a cryptic way where you need the oral tradition in order to prove who are the true owners. Let's look at a modern day example, a short clip here, 20 seconds. The Coca-Cola company. They have the secret recipe of how they make Coca-Cola, but they don't want anybody to know. So of course they know writing it down digitally is susceptible of being hacked, of being found. So they have one and only one printed copy with very limited access to who can access these
A
files.
printed copy of the full formula lies inside a secure vault on the grounds of the World of Coca-Cola in Atlanta. Apart from that, only 2 employees are privy to the complete formula at any given time, and they are not permitted to travel together. The identity of these 2 employees is itself a secret.
So they understand that you need to keep it a secret in order for it to survive. Let's move on to point number 3. And Caroline, if you'd like to read answer number 3, preserving.
Preserving content. Passing the oral Torah down from generation to generation can actually be a better way of preserving the teachings of Moses heard from God. In the following text, the Maimonides argues this very point. The Maimonides guide to the perplexed. Even the traditional law, as you are well aware, was not originally committed to writing in conformity with the rule to which our nation generally adhered. Things which I have communicated to you orally, you must not communicate to others in writing. With reference to the law, this law was very opportune. For while it remained in force, it averted the evils which happened subsequently. Great diversity of opinion, doubts as to the meaning of the written words, slips of the pen, dissensions among the people, formation of new sects, and confused notions about practical subjects. When something is recorded, okay.
No, you can read those last 2 lines. Yep.
When something is recorded in writing, then any individual can pick it up, read it, and interpret it as he or she sees fit.
Very good. So to explain what we just read here, it's like, imagine you have a spy pen, a pen that you could write down a message and no one can read it unless they have a UV light. The Torah is like this spy pen. It writes messages. The UV light is the oral tradition, which helps us read the messages of God. Why was it done this way? Because it allows us to preserve the text and make sure we understand it correctly. If it was all written, there would be mass misrepresentation of the text. People would not understand what they're reading. We'll use a example that would be easy for us to understand. Would you go to a doctor that never went to medical school, but he read all the books on medicine? Would you go on a plane with a pilot that has never flown a plane or gone to pilot school, but he read all the books there are to read on how to be a pilot? I would say books are nice for reading the text. However, you need real training with other doctors. You need to go to school and hear from a doctor, number one, to make sure you understood the text properly. And we want the doctor to go through residency, where he has training from veteran doctors to make sure that he's getting proper understanding and knowledge in how to deal with circumstances. So how do we make sure he doesn't make mistakes? By allowing him to not just follow the text, but also follow up with real life results, real life problems, and getting on the grounds with the feet in the boots on the ground in order to actually perform the tasks. We want this doctor to have the same medical standards as the enlarged medical community. So too, preserving the oral Torah allows for this same idea. We don't just want someone to read the text and decide they know what God means. We want them to hear from the previous generation, those that have studied the text and got down the message from those before them, in order to make sure you're properly understanding the text, you have the expertise, you have the knowledge, you have the experience with dealing with applying the text in a day-to-day life. So preserves the context when you have to listen to a teacher instead of just reading the books and assuming you understand everything properly. Let's move on to point number 4. And Sheila, if you'd like to read from the Maharal and then text number 18.
Maharal provides a more Kabbalistic interpretation of the advantage of the oral Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Low, the Maharal of Prague, Tiferet Israel, The explanation is that the Torah is the covenant and connection between God and the Jewish people who receive his laws. This connection is mainly realized in the oral Torah, which is not written on parchment, but exists within the person himself. Therefore, the oral Torah is a covenant and connection that combines the giver of the Torah with the receivers of the Torah.
Very good. So to explain what he's saying, let's use an example of a list, a to-do list. Why do we write down sometimes a to-do list? Well,
So you don't forget.
Right. So sometimes we write it down so we don't forget. But let's read this little statement here. Sometimes there's nothing like having a long to-do list that makes you feel like doing nothing at all. Because if we write everything down on the to-do list, we're left with a free mind, and we don't do it all because it's not a part of us. It's all on the paper. Sometimes if everything in the Torah would be written, we wouldn't feel a responsibility. We wouldn't feel like we're part of the chain. We're necessary. We need to study it. We need to teach it to the next generation. What do you mean? If you have any problems, just go it over there. It's all written down clearly. I don't have to be a part of this transition, a part of this transmission from one generation to the next. It's all good. Everybody could read it. My grandchild could read it in the book, and then it will be lost. If you want it to be a part of them, you have to make them a part of it. Make each person a part of the transmission from one generation to the next. How? By making a part of it oral. So we have to teach our children. We have to show them how to read. If we don't do that, then it all stays in the books and our mind stays completely disconnected from this idea. Let's read it over here. Caroline, if you'd like to read the Torah.
The Torah is the glue that combines the Jewish people with God. The written Torah exists as an independent entity, the Torah scroll, and therefore cannot serve as a direct conduit to God. The oral Torah, however, exists as concepts in the mind of God and in the minds of the Jewish people. This creates a deeper connection between God and the Jewish people. The oral Torah literally has no existence outside of the human being. In a sense, every individual is an oral Torah. In other words, the written Torah is a guide. The oral Torah is a relationship. Inscribing the Torah on our minds, hearts, and souls ensures that the Torah can never be stolen from us. It becomes part of our very identity. It also makes every person in every generation feel the awesome responsibility to be an active transmitter. We can never rely on the book alone.
Very good. So to use an example, let's ask, what do we have from 3,000 years ago? And the answer is maybe you could find a few pots, a few barrels, a few jugs. That's about it. Why is it that we don't have a lot more? Because when it's something is written down, something is a physical object, it's not going to be as long lasting as a lesson that's taught over verbally, because an object can get destroyed, burnt, lost, but something that was taught, something that was given over, it's not tangible. That doesn't get lost or stolen or burnt. That is something that lives on. And that is why an interesting aspect, if you notice, we're not called scripturalism. We're not called Torahism. We're called Judaism. Why Judaism? Because it's the Jewish people that makes the Jewish religion. There isn't a Torah on its own, and then we just perform the Torah. It's the Jewish people are the ones that make the religion. It's the Judah that makes the ism. It's the person, by performing the acts, by having the Torah part of his life, something in his mind where he studies it, he understands it, he comprehends, he asks the questions, he memorizes it, he passes it on to the next person orally, where he's actively hands-on, not just buying a book and giving it on to the next person. That is what ensures that it will last. And that's why these artifacts, we have very limited of them. We don't have even a written Torah from 3,000 years ago, but we have the lessons of the Torah, word for word, the commandments, the ideas of the Torah. We have them today just as they had them 3,000 years ago, because it's not so much the written as much as we need the lesson, as much as we need to have it written in our hearts more than just written in a book. With that, we'll conclude. Let's just read the summary and then the final key points. So Sheila, if you'd like to read summary over here.
God wants an oral Torah because the Torah is too vast to completely transcribe. Oral teachings cannot be stolen, and oral tradition ensures that every student will learn it properly from a reliable teacher. The oral Torah is written on the people, creating a stronger connection.
Very good. So these are the 3 points. The third point of the class, in total, it gives 4 explanations. So just to recap in a moment before we get to the key points, the 3 sections that we had for this class, number 1 is that there are 2 parts of the Torah, the written and the oral. Point number 2 we said was, what are the proofs of the oral Torah? And we said a few proofs, the fact that everybody keeps the same traditions, meaning everybody has passed down the same version of the Torah. We all celebrate it, whether all the holidays are celebrated in similar fashions. The fact that it's not possible to understand the Torah on its own, and the Torah hints to it in certain aspects. And the third section of the class was, why does God want it this way? And like we have over here, these 4 reasons that it's intentional that there is an oral part. So let's read the key points. And Caroline, if you'd like to read 1 through 5, and Sheila 6 through 10.
The Torah has 2 parts, the written law and the oral law. Number 2, even though the written law is not comprehensible on its own, all Jews have interpreted it similarly for thousands of years. Number 3, the written law is impossible to understand on its own and relies on the oral law. Number 4, the written law makes reference to the oral law, confirming its truth. Number 5, the Torah is too vast to completely transcribe.
Very good. Okay, and Sheila.
Oral teachings cannot be stolen. Oral teachings live on in the people, even when the books are gone. Oral teachings put responsibility on the individuals of every generation to be active transmitters. Oral teachings ensure that every student will gain internship to get the full context and not rely on the books alone. The Torah is written on the people and not just on the books.
Beautiful. Yeah, great. So thank you. With that, we conclude the class. And it was a pleasure to have you all join. We'll
Thank
be
you.
happy. Next
Thank
week, Sunday
you.
is Passover. And
Right.
the week after that is Passover again. The last day is a Passover.
Right.
So we probably won't be having the class for the next 2 weeks. But wishing you all a happy and kosher Passover. And we will be in touch. We'll follow up afterwards with class number 7.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Bye,
Bye. Give regards.
Shabbat tov.
Shabbat
Bye.
shalom.
Give regards.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.